Hi, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Yates Conversations. My name is Rob Doggett. I'm coming to you on behalf of the International Yates Society and from the State University of New York at Geneseo, where I teach. And today I'm here with Emilie Morin, and it's great to see you, Emily. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks so much, Rob, for having me. Delighted to be here today.
Well, welcome. And you are a professor of modern literature at the University of York. People will know you, a lot of the viewers of this will know you from you've been publishing off and on for years on Yates. They'll know your special issue that you were on for the Journal of the International Yates Studies. And I know you focus a lot on Yates and media, Yates and radio. Others Other people are going to know you as a major figure in Beckett studies, of course, and two of your monographs, Samuel Beckett and the Problem of Irishness, and Samuel Beckett's Political Imagination. And I haven't seen it yet, but I know you have a book that's come out on Suzanne Beckett, and you also have an anthology on early radio that I think came out in 2023, but it's just been released in paperback. So I don't know if you want to say anything about those two recent works or anything else you're working on.
Yeah, I'd love to. I suppose they're quite biographically oriented. I've been interested in trying to recover lost lives, thinking a lot about facts, and then trying to map um, biographical facts in areas where that has been sorely lacking, broadly
Mhm.
speaking. So, yeah.
Early radio, that's the anthology. I
Mm.
haven't checked that out. I'm really interested in it. So what were some of the insights you from that?
Well, the idea was to go back to the very first years of radio, the first decade and a half, broadly speaking. Um, and the idea came to me when, I'd been reading the sort of the canonical works on radio, Adorno, Brecht. There's also a famous essay by Donald McQuinney,
Hmm.
and I would find them a little bit kind of suspended in time. And one day I was in the British Library, and I thought, how about I thought I should look for journalism and essays from the early years of radio. So I started to dig for essays written about, the aesthetics of radio in the 1920s, and I was astonished by what I found.
Mm.
The quality of the insights, the vision,
Hmm.
and also I was surprised to see that many of these people had been completely forgotten, and because a lot of them died before the end of the Second World War. Their work was out of copyright. So I thought, actually, I've got here a manageable copyright project. So I started to kind of gather these ideas. And what kind of came to light is that those works that we hail as, innovative masterpieces about what radio can do, that date from the 1940s, 1950s. What they do is actually just summarize ideas that were constantly in circulation in the very early years. And that's interesting for radio drama, especially, but also for ideas about the voice. And I suppose what got me into this in the first place was, thinking about Yeats and radio.
I had for me the I love I'll play the Yates recordings that are available for my students, and I always think about performances like in the Poets Pub. And it's hard for me, it always comes across as really corny. But it's hard to get a sense of the context because I just don't know what the conventions, a lot of the different and imagine they're complicated and there's not one convention. But I'm
Mhm.
interested in checking out that book to get a sense of the period and kind of situate what Yates is doing there. Anyway, we should move on to Moll Magee. So I gotta say, when I was thinking about these Yates conversations and I was going through my list of what kinds of poems people would be interested in, I can't say Moll Magee was one that came to mind right away. And most people choose, I mean, they're kind of the Yates conversations tend to be weighted toward the later poems, a lot of the more famous ones. So this is like, I think this might be the earliest poem in this series and probably the least famous of the poems we're covering. So what got you interested in talking about the Ballad of Moll Magee?
So yeah, I was interested in it because I've been interested in how poverty is represented in Yeats's writing. I mean, it's a familiar topic. We all think it's been done to death in relation to the literature of the Irish revival, in relation to Yeats. But I think it remains a challenging issue and that it's worth revisiting that periodically. And I've been interested in, um, I suppose, how his proximity to real poverty can be looked at from a materialist perspective, and
Hmm.
then using that perspective to think about what he witnessed and also the manner of his witnessing. And the more I started to look into this, the more this struck me as a genuinely deep issue because there is a social reality registered in Yeats's work, especially in places where we don't expect that social reality to kick in. So what kind of social reality is this? Can we retrace it? And these are challenges that interest me at the moment. I've been interested also in what a reparative historicist practice might mean
Hmm.
um, more generally. And I think Yeats is a really interesting candidate for this because of the complexity and richness of his career, but also because the field of Yeats studies got over his politics a long time ago and is a field that is very attuned to the complexity of circumstance and character. And that those are traits that I admire very much. I think it's, yeah, I'm just trying to think about those broader issues. And the Ballad of Moll Magee is especially interesting because it sheds light on facets of Yeats' psyche that are rarely discussed.
Hmm.
Um, it is also a transparent poem.
Hmm.
It doesn't look like a poem that was written by him. Um, and as you say, it's an early poem, so it was published in 1889 alongside the Wanderings of Ossian, in the Wanderings of Ossian and other poems, and later as part of Crossways. And this is a poem that is very unlike Yeats's other texts on poverty because it is not digressive.
Hmm.
Um, his eye doesn't move away throughout and remains fixated on our speaker.
Hmm.
So this is one of the only works by Yeats focused on poverty um, that, where there's no digression.
Hmm.
The social reality that Yeats looks at is looked at in the face all the way through, and it's a poem about exploitation, about precarity, about the death of an infant. It's also about shift labor and about childcare. And it's also a poem that is written in a different poetic mode. There are many marginalized figures in Yeats's poetry, but if we look at Tom the Lunatic or Crazy Jane, they do not speak like that.
Hmm.
Moll Magee has quite a unique
I
kind of
was thinking
fiction.
that, yeah, immediately started to think about Crazy Jane and how, as I was looking back at this poem, and again, it's not one that I teach, and in part, I think it's because probably, and as you're talking, I'm realizing I'm sort of not giving this poem enough. I don't think I've given this poem enough credit, um, but I don't see it as sort of typical of Yeats, and I usually assign it when we're doing those early poems, but I can't honestly remember a time I've really talked about it in class, and I've certainly spent a lot more time on Crazy Jane, and those much later poems, and certainly other ballads of his. And so this is one that I'm interested in what you're saying about thinking about poverty and sort of material conditions and the kind of realities during this period. So let's say, if you don't mind, let's have you read it first, and then we can go
Sure.
through it.
The Ballad of Moll Magee. Come around me, little childer. There, don't fling stones at me, because I mutter as I go, but pity Moll Magee. My man was a poor fisher, with shorelines in the say. My work was salting herrings the whole of the long day. And sometimes from the salting shed, I scarce could drag my feet under the blessed moonlight along the pebbly street. I'd always been but weakly, and my baby was just born. A neighbour minded her by day, I minded her till morn. I lay upon my baby, ye little childer dear. I looked on my cold baby when the morn grew frosty and clear. A weary woman sleeps so hard. My man grew red and pale, and gave me money and bade me go to my own place Kinsale. He drove me out and shut the door and gave his curse to me. I went away in silence, no neighbour could I see. The windows and the doors were shut, one star shone faint and green. The little straws were turning round across the bare boreen. I went away in silence, beyond old Martin's byre. I saw a kindly neighbour blow in her morning fire. She drew from me my story, my money's all used up, and still with pitying scorn in eye she gives me bite and sup. She says my man will surely come and fetch me home again, but always as I'm moving round, without doors or within, piling the wood or piling the turf or going to the well, I'm thinking of my baby and keening to myself. And sometimes I am sure she knows when opening wide his door, God lights the stars, his candles, and looks upon the poor. So now, you little chidler, you don't fling stones at me, but gather with your shining looks and pity Moll Magee.
Thanks. So this is as I was saying before, it's not a poem I often teach, and I tend to think about, the last, I don't know, criticism since gosh, since people like Ellman even when you see this poem, there's it's pretty dismissive. It's sort of viewed as kind of conventional, a bit sentimental, sort of in the slipstream of Wordsworth, I suppose. But not, and as you're saying before, it's different from a lot of his early poetry. I also think of his fairy and folk tales and things collected in the Celtic Twilight, where child mortality, it's wrapped up with the fairies and the spirits, and it's often about, there's the one I think from his Village Ghosts where the woman forgets to open the doors to let the spirit out, that sort of thing. So it's focused on the spiritual, and this isn't. It's focused on actual, I think, material conditions, as you're saying. So um, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that, how it engages with material realities, and I think the context as well. I know it's written or it's from memories in Hoth when he was living there with his family, that period of 4 years. But it's setting, and it doesn't need, well, it's got the fishing community. So anyway, I'll let you talk about all that. Go ahead.
So yeah, for me, there are lots of questions about where this poem came from. Because Yeats's words about it were quite tentative. He said it came from a sermon preached in the chapel at Howth, if I remember rightly. So he wasn't quite sure. Um, and I started, as I was, preparing for this, I started to think, well, what could such a sermon have been about? Is this about some sort of educational sermon to the fishermen and fisherwomen of the village, to not sleep in the same bed as their children, or make sure there's some sort of something in place, but that doesn't quite fit with the context. It sounds more like something you might have heard about, a personal tragedy he heard about, from listening in when his mother was talking with local people, possibly. I had a look as well, at newspaper reports from the 1880s, 1890s. Infanticide was quite was a topic that was regularly reported on. Women were by default the guilty party. There's a lot of scholarship on this infanticide in 19th century Ireland. A lot of it was driven by just terrible poverty, not being able to provide for children, but also children born out of wedlock,
Mhm.
which placed the women, especially if they were working, and especially in impossible situations. So this is well documented. But Moll Magee doesn't belong to that category at all,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
and we don't know what happened to that child. It's a sudden infant death. It might have been an involuntary infanticide. She certainly feels that way, our speaker in this poem, but we don't know for sure what happened. Um, the
It's
imagery,
interesting.
is it?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's interesting about the sort of first of all the kind of didactic elements and the way that the poem seems to end with a bit of a kind of assertion or affirmation or call to a kind of Christian charity and God opening his doors to all that sort of thing. But the force of the poem for me is all sort of before that. It's in the expression of her sorrow and her condition. So we have a kind of didactic frame, which makes sense maybe coming out of whatever sermon this was. And it's hard to imagine Gates in the in some chapel in of all places. But I think it sounds to me like it makes sense what you're saying, some kind of local, gossip or story. But that idea of like, is it we get the sense of the tradition of this ballad as offering a kind of Christian lesson, but the force of the poem for me is not doesn't have to do much with that at all, and it's really centered on Moll Magee. I was wondering though about the idea of the poem, and this was just curious to me. I mean, I had a sense of this when you're talking about the infanticide, etc. The larger context of that, but again, this is maybe sudden infant death or something like that. But the idea of the woman being blamed and cast out, did you in your research on this, is that sort of a common response to, was that something that would happen if a child died under any sort of mysterious circumstances? The woman's not just blamed, but cast out of the house?
Well, in the newspaper reports, I was looking at, yes, and sometimes there was a sort of complicity between
Mhm.
a mother and her own mother, especially when these were crimes. But again,
Mhm.
this is very, very different.
Yeah.
A lot of these women appear to have already been marginalized anyway,
Uh-huh.
to not have had much of a social fabric around them.
Hmm.
I mean, Moll is the most marginalized of the marginalized.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
she does not appear to have been married. She refers to my man.
Hmm.
She is far away from home and family. And I would say she's precisely the kind of woman that Catholic doctrine doesn't care for.
Hmm.
You know, she's too poor. She's too and
Yeah.
her own refuge is in a kind of a picture book version of religion. You know,
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
idea that somehow when night comes, God opens his door and shine lights upon the poor through the
Hmm.
stars. And she seems to be speaking to the stars
It's interesting.
as
Yeah, I
well.
mean, reminds me a little bit of sort of the chimney sweep in Blake and that kind of picture book
Yeah.
from the version in the Songs of Innocence of the child imagining some again heaven via some kind of picture book, and that does make sense to me. And so you're saying that in the use of my man, that's suggesting she's not married.
Well, we don't know, but
Yeah, I guess we don't
yeah,
know. Yeah,
we
yeah,
don't
that's
know.
interesting. That's
We
interesting.
don't know, but he drives her out pretty easily, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um, and nobody's interested in finding out what happened. She just gets shunned. All the doors get shut.
Yeah.
Um, it's really quite remarkable, and it's just not the kind of poem I would personally associate with Yeats during that period. Yes, there are little moments in the Celtic twilight and so on that come to mind,
Hmm.
but this is really going quite deep into somebody's life story, and it's an eminently plausible.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's a personal tragedy that gets told all the way through here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's quite interesting. Um,
And
one
what?
one thing I've found when I was looking into this, which is really interesting, is that this, as you say, we all think of it as just an incidental poem. Like you, I hadn't paid that much attention to it until recently, but I've always been obsessed with the Crazy Jane poems. And what appears to be a sudden switch to that other voice, I think actually comes from deeper down, and we can trace it back to this.
Hmm.
Um, but the early reviewers of the Wanderings of Oisin and other poems were very struck by this poem. And I wouldn't say it's systematically mentioned because I haven't been able to collect every single review, but it is very often mentioned. George Russell praised it in an essay called The Poet of Shadows. Um, Talks about Moll Magee as a recognizable human figure who contrasts with the rest of Yeats's figures who are, he says, from another world.
Hmm.
There's also a very positive uh, mention of the poem in the Bookman, a ballad. The reviewer says, fashioned not after literary models, but rather after rough chanting chronicles, and is evoking here the bards of Brittany.
Hmm.
Um, there's a very Todd Hunter's review of the volume ends with a mention of Moll Magee before it talks about Yeats's talent.
Hmm.
I've got the quote there somewhere. Um, so it's yes, Todd Hunter, 1889, and the Academy. The Ballad of Moll Magee is too long to give entire because he'd been quoting chunks from the other poems and would be mutilated by quotation. It deserves special mention as a successful descent from the cloudlands of fantasy to the real world. It is a pathetic tale of an Irish woman turned out of house by her husband for overlaying her child, told us by herself in perfectly simple language. That
Hmm.
Mr. Yeats has a poetic gift which deserves recognition, there can be no doubt. It remains to be seen what he will finally make of this gift. And that is the end of the review. It was also, you'll be interested to hear, set to music by an Irish composer, O'Brien Butler, in 1899.
Oh.
And that was singled out for praise in a periodical called the Musical Standard. And this was someone Yeats knew and was on friendly terms with. Later on, it was broadcast by the BBC as part of the first broadcasts of Yeats's poems that kind of were, foregrounded as such. Twice, 1928, 1929, which is noteworthy because that's also when they went for the big Yeats, hits like the Lake Isle of Innisfree and so on.
Hmm.
In 1959, when there was a record of Yeats's poems with, I believe, his readings and also readings by Siobhan McKenna, the Ballad of Moll Magee was also selected. So it's a poem that has had a much richer life than what we would imagine. Um, and that's really interesting because it's also atypical.
It's really surprising to me how, as you assemble that, the through line from those early reviews, and I did not, I confess, I did not realize the extent to which early reviewers singled out that poem for praise. So that's interesting to me. And then the return or that through line with the BBC is interesting. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the fact that the BBC saw this particular poem as one that they wanted to make sure was included in these broadcasts?
I'm not sure at all. It's very peculiar. Very, very peculiar because the subject matter is so transparent.
Hmm.
Um, and it's yeah, I'm not sure at all. I'm not sure at all. But the BBC did have idiosyncratic tastes in its with poetry choices. And I don't know how these particular broadcasts were,
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
things were selected. But that they should have identified this as, a great poem worthy of broadcasting,
Hmm.
I
It
think is
seems,
noteworthy.
I mean, it seems like a very accessible and, poem, and in some ways, very relatable kind of poem. I mean, it's easy to think of these impoverished conditions and a woman under these circumstances and the kind of strong emotional affect that's generated in the poem. And it's funny having read it a couple of times now. I was reading a couple times last night after not having looked at it for quite some time, and it was just. It is a more forceful poem than I remember it. I think it's often because I'm reading it in in Crossways or in just, reading it as part of a big group and I'm thinking about what I'm going to teach and I'm like, oh gosh, I really want to focus on the Song of the Happy Shepherd and the Sad Shepherd, or I want to focus on Innisfree, or I want to focus on the Stolen Child, and all very, very different poems. And then you have this one that sort of is an outlier, and I don't think I've appreciated its emotional kind of force in it and in her just, I think, straightforward expression of her condition. And like you said, this picture book kind of longing, which makes it more deeply moving, I think. You started a moment ago, though, you were talking about the imagery, and I was just curious what
Mhm.
some thoughts you had about the imagery.
Mm. Yeah, the colors are very interesting. In in a literal sense, if we go down the that picture book analogy and think about colors, everything is it's after sunset or before sunrise. It seems to, everything seems to be taking place in this kind of half light or no light.
Hmm.
Um, there is paleness everywhere.
Yeah.
The
I,
cold baby, she's a weary woman. The man grows red and pale. And then there is a contrast, which is interesting, um, with her neighbors. The kindly neighbor is also looking at her with pitying, scorning eye, and there's a sense that, the generosity might dry up. The children have shining looks,
mhm,
which positions them as direct opposites to the dead infant, of course, but also, um, I don't know. I just got a sense of a circle of wolves sort of getting closer and closer to her. What's
mhm,
extraordinary is that the interlocutor here is the little child, is little children who
mhm,
are throwing stones, who are not behaving in any way that would be commendable, and they
mhm.
are only interlocutors.
Yeah, and that
Um,
framing with the throwing, casting stones at her, of course, and that there are the biblical resonances of all that in the
yeah,
backdrop from the Gospels. And yeah, it's such a, but the imagery is, you're right, there's that so much paleness in here, and a kind of that imagery evokes the kind of this barren, stale condition, but there's moments of also luminosity, and then the sense of being. I mean, I think as you're talking about again in our conversation, this always happens. I appreciate the films more through the conversations, but the sense of her as the object of the gaze of the children, and sort of as the experience of being one who's looked at by the community as an outcast is really forceful here. I find my man grew red and pale. That line is striking again because of the imagery. It sounds a little bit sort of odd all of a sudden. I guess I don't know. What do you think of that moment in the poem? Is that imagery meant to just capture kind of embarrassment, red and pale, or outrage, or I wonder what it's communicating there.
I think terrible rage and horror all at
Yeah,
once.
yeah,
But
yeah,
um, it's interesting how his redness and paleness are what also exonerate him from any responsibility. Um, this
yeah.
is, I mean, yeah. What's also striking to me is that, she's just had a baby. She's probably just, and the poem is so untransparent that we can say this. She's just had a baby and then gone back to work all day salting fish. And of course, that's going to end up in some sort of disaster.
Right.
Um, and yeah, and Yeats's sensitivity to that, I think, is really quite remarkable. Um,
That is interesting, and gosh, you don't. It really is the thinking about the kinds of material realities that the poem evokes, that's in a different way than a lot of Yeats's poetry. So you've got this sense of, what it would be like to have given birth and then immediately going back to work in the fishing industry, and then this horrible death that occurs. And then the sort of matter-of-fact way she describes about what happened with the man who,
Mm.
he just got red and pale, gave her money and said, go away, go back to Kinsale. And there's no sort of, we don't get her thoughts about how she viewed what he did, or if there's any reason for it. There's just a sort of, this is what happened. And a sense of, my sense here is a person who's always being, in passive positions, having been acted upon and not having much agency. So it's a sort of just, this is the way the world goes. This is what happens. Um, and that sort of adds, I think, emotional force to the poem.
Yeah. There's also a sense that, the circumstance doesn't really allow her to
Yeah,
have her own judgment. I mean, she's lost everything imaginable, and she had very little to start with.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's
yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that. That's right. I think that's exactly the point, right? Like she doesn't have the agency and is not allotted any sort of power or privilege to actually cast any judgment. And
no.
that I think that's part of the
One
problem.
thing that interested me as well was the way her only area of agency involves working herself away from her silence,
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and it seems to begin with the neighbor getting the words out of her. She says she drew from me my story.
Hmm.
Um, and then once the words come out, they seem unstoppable. And she might be going around muttering to herself.
Hmm.
Um, so there's something really powerful here. Um, it's um, it's both there's a life sentence being sort of imposed, externally, internally, and again we don't quite know what happened, um, and there's also something else, some sort of, I wouldn't say a liberation, but some sort of way out through words, through speaking,
Hmm.
and thinking, and looking at stars, and but that endless process of mourning is conveyed, I think, very well. And it amazes me that Yeats, at that age, could have written so sensitively about a woman who's just had a child and who's lost the child.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
such a, yeah, it just seems very. It seems like the sort of negative image of the Celtic twilight in a way. To me, also, I was thinking this is kind of a counterpoint to The Stolen Child, which is a poem I've been obsessed with forever. And I think it's only recently that I really began to understand it, looking at it alongside Moll Magee. Because The Stolen Child is about a child who's made it to this other world that is free of suffering and free of weeping.
Hmm.
And Moll Magee is about the people who have stayed behind.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
It's
but
really interesting. Yeah. It's really interesting because I think that is the next time I teach the Stolen Child, I'm going to pair it with Mal McGee because I think that really is it underscores that idea of what's going on in Mal McGee about the people who are left behind. Because in the Stolen Child, it's so much on the boy is solemnized at the end, of course, but it's about the boy giving up something, right? These kind of comforts, but then going off in the world of the fairies. And that kind of tension we often get in these Celtic Twilight poems between like the world of reality and the world of the fairy. But so much stress is put on the world of the fairy. And there's a little bit of just the calves lowing on the Wormhill side, the kettle on the hob, that sort of thing. But it's just these little material objects signaling comfort. In the Ballad of Mom McGee, it's like, what about the mom? What about the family that
yeah.
is left behind? As you're talking too, of course, I was reminded, and I think you're right about the sensitivity about writing of Yeats writing about someone who's lost a child. Of course, his mother did lose two children, and so I suspect maybe some of that's in the
Yeah.
background to his brother and his sister. I think his sister died very young. I think maybe she wasn't even hadn't even reached a year of age. Um, and so the gendering of the child here in the poem as well. So a daughter. And it makes such a neat in any case, I think it makes such a neat framing with the stolen child and such a different kind of poem as well. Um, I was also struck by what you're saying about muttering. At the start of she's muttering, and then the poem is a kind of processing, but not in that stupid cliched sense, but like just work going through the grief and putting it into words to that final assertion. And even though it's a picture book sort of vision of God welcoming, there is also her saying, don't throw stones at me. There is a voice there at the end, which is powerful. Can you
Yeah.
talk about I wanted to ask you too about the context. I mean, you mentioned the sort of fishing industry and that sort of thing that you work a little
Hmm.
bit on Yates's, and I know you've done other work on this, like Yates's proximity early on to poverty in the places he lived in London, for example.
Hmm.
I wonder if you talk a little bit more about that kind of material context.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, one thing that I think remains to be done in a more serious way, and this will sound completely crazy, but I think the Yeats's Yeats's fascination for the world of fairies, I think, could do with a bit more of a materialist understanding. Because when you look at this kind of thing closely, you can see that these are just ways of trying to come to terms with premature death, generally the death of a child, um, generally in contexts where the church doesn't really bring much solace apart
Hmm.
from, possibly blaming parents for their failure to live well or their failure to provide or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and I, you know, and I haven't been able to find scholarship on this, but there seems to be a connection between infant deaths, unexplained infant deaths, and belief in the fairies that they were captured
Hmm.
in order to make this understandable. And of course, I mean, I haven't managed to find figures or anything, but just infant mortality was such a um, common issue, which of course would have hurt women like Magee more, but was prevalent across all sections of society. And it's interesting that among the people that I mentioned to you who've responded well to the poem, so York Powell also really liked it,
Hmm.
apparently. But these were all men, you know?
Hmm.
And this is a poem that is really quite intensely about women and about a very vulnerable period of time after the birth of a child, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, I've been trying to think about those kinds of issues, and I don't have kind of direct information about health or about you know the context there. But one thing I was looking at recently was Woburn buildings and where Yeats
Oh,
was
you live.
living.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the LSC has published a full record of Charles Booth's poverty map of London with Booth's legends, and this dates from 1886 to 1903. And we have a number of interesting observations about Woburn buildings. So I'm just going to show you. I've got a couple of slides there.
And
Uh,
this is again in London for people. This is again in London when Yates lived in London.
Yeah, so this was after
Yeah.
Moll. So about in terms of the composition of Moll, we know. We don't know for sure when it was written. We know that it may have been written by June 1887. It was definitely written by November 1888 because that's when Yeats was beginning to send it around. And it seems to have been written at the same time as another lost ballad, which was about, I quote, uh, an old, let me just find the
The person in
precise
an
particular.
asylum, I think, right?
Yeah, a Sligo ballad of the mad woman,
Yeah.
and that's lost. So we don't know, but basically it's part of a whole collection of poems in which Yeats is looking at the most outcast among the outcast and showing that these women have experienced something, that something
Hmm.
happened to them.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, so that's the context. So Yeats wasn't living in Woburn Buildings then. I'm just going to show you, but later on, when he lived in Woburn Buildings, he was really living in close proximity to intense poetry, intense poverty. So this is Woburn Buildings here. And as we can see, so that's a street that is now called Flaxman Terrace. And the legends, Booth's legends, say very poor, casual, chronic want. This is all in blue.
Huh.
And we also have some notes, some of Booth's notes, which I've got there on the next slides, but covering Woburn Buildings, Flaxman Terrace, which was a Brunton place, and then Mabledon Place. So these are the notes. I'm hoping I can't see very well. My screen is very small. But Brunton Place is a street, I quote, rough Irish, thieves overcrowding, all doors open, windows patched or dirty, women sitting on doorstep, suckling babies, children pale and very dirty,
Hmm.
much drunkenness. Yeah, so that's Brunton Place, today's Flaxman Terrace. So right at the end of Woburn Buildings in the continuation there. Further on, so that's the walk Woburn Buildings is mentioned here. General remarks. Brunton Place and North Crescent Mews gives a sudden check to the prosperity of the Bedford estate. And further on, yeah, there are mentions of Mabledon Place, practically Brussels there.
Hmm.
So
It's
it's
I was just
I
gonna
think
say
it
it's really
painted a
interesting.
number of things, you know. It's quite extreme really. The extremes quite remarkable, the extremes of poverty and wealth to which he was exposed in his first sort of couple of decades as a poet. Um
I love the idea. I mean, just as you're reading about the pale children, of course, and you hear the, you can't help but to think back to the Ballad of Moll Magee. But also for me, it's we tend to, or at least I tend to, when I think about London and Yeats's early writings about London, I fit it into his retrospective mythologizing, where London sort of represents that, logic, science, industry, grayness, modernity, all that stuff, which is fine. It fits the juxtaposition with places like Sligo. Um, but you forget like the actual material realities as you get lost in the Yeatsian mythologizing and that proximity to real poverty there. And what's striking to me, and as you were showing that map, is and you just highlighted it, the juxtaposition between wealth and poverty. And I hadn't really appreciated that in London geography. I tend to have a more American, I don't know, American notion of contemporary cities where it's really enclaves of wealth and poverty really clearly separated out, and not as much of that kind of mixing. Um, and to see it there is really interesting, especially thinking about Yeats in this kind of artistic community, and then right around the corner there, women, suckling children outside, pale children, obviously high rates of infant mortality.
yeah. Yeah. This is later, that Yeats lives there, but he was at ease there. He lived there for a long time and that's quite telling. So yeah, it's I think there's some mysteries, you know. around context still. And of course, a lot of this is no longer visible because London is London and it's
Mhm.
Bloomsbury.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah, and it's and it just it kind of sheds. I know, and again, I know it's afterwards that he's living there, but it does help us as we're thinking back on Moll Magee to recognize the degree to which he is engaging with material realities. And it's not something we think of in Yates, but it is a feature. I mean, it is something that runs throughout his works if we attend to it. But we often move into the clouds. And I like what you said about the earlier views, the juxtaposition, with George Russell to the world of shadows, and then we get in this poem a kind of reality. So that's great. I don't know, is there anything else you want to cover with the poem any other thing we want to make sure we take away here?
I just wanted to show you all another poem that takes on a new dimension in light of Moll because I was thinking, okay, the stolen child is a precedent, and then we find other hardworking women in Yeats's poetry, for example, in the Song of the Old Mother, and then there's Crazy Jane. Um, but there is a little bit more than this. And I like to think that these seemingly mad women that kind of come in every so often into Yeats's poetry belong to a line. And there's another one called Old Madge,
Old
who
Madge, yeah.
appears,
Ballad
um,
of is it the man young and old, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
in the friends of his youth. Um, Laughter, not time, destroyed my voice and put that crack in it. And when the moon's pot bellied, I get a laughing fit. For that old match comes down the lane, a stone upon her breast, and a cloak wrapped about the stone. And she can get no rest without singing hush and hushaby. She that has been wild and barren as a breaking wave thinks that the stone's a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I think again that's an extraordinary moment. Extraordinary. There is less compassion, but the compassion is still there. And that a character like Old Madge, who probably was real in some way, because you don't make up that sort of thing, should have come into that collection written at the height of, Yeats's career. Is I think really, really interesting. I think it's interesting to read Yeats against the grain, generally speaking, because there's so much in the poetry. I mean, this is extraordinary. Um,
I really like
um,
the connection with that later poem. I was talking with my students the other day about the fairy tales, and there was a line they were asking about where one of the people in the fairy tales says the fairies would substitute for the child a log, and they were I I I was I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but the students in my class were really struck by that and felt I could see them getting pretty emotional about it. And it sort of reminded me as you're reading that later poem of the woman carrying the stone and the this idea of life becoming an inanimate object, something alive, then becomes this material thing that's still there, and how heartbreaking it is to think of that, this inanimate object now that once was alive. And, the fairy substitution plays, the sort of game that something's been stolen and substituted. But when we think about infant mortality, the reality, of course, is that it's like the thing that was alive is now dead, and confronting the fact of the body and the how difficult it is to make sense of that. And then the idea of the woman out on the road carrying the stone with her to give it comfort is really heartbreaking. So I think that connection makes a lot of sense. Um, well, this has been great. A poem I don't really teach very often, and now I've got a ton more to say about it. I hope people watching learned a lot, and I hope people go back and take a look at this poem, which really is. I'm way more interested in the poem than I was at the start of our conversation. So thanks for that. Well,
Thank you so much.
yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to see you. Maybe I'll see you at the next International Yates Society annual meeting, which I think this year will be in Houston in December. So that's our next one. And we've got a couple other ones I think planned for Europe after that, but we're not sure. But anyway, I hope to see you at some point in person in the not too distant future. So thank you and
Me
take
too.
care.
Thank you, Rob. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.